stragglers that will be joining us. So we'll be back in about 30 seconds. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. We're delighted to be here with you. Active Transportation Alliance has gotten to partner. It's an honor to do so with two spectacularly qualified and knowledgeable people in the world of cycling research and study. Mr. John Pucher from Rutgers University and Mr. Ralph Buehler from Virginia Tech are going to wow us with their findings that they have published in a new book, Cycling for Sustainable Cities. Julie, go ahead and advance the slide for me, please. Just to set the table a little bit, for those of you who are follow kind of this sort of thing avidly like we do at Active Trans, the People for Bikes organization came out with their annual rating of cities and their quality, the quality of bicycling in those cities. While they use I'm not familiar with their methodology, I can tell you that a city rating of 16 for the city of Chicago out of 100 possible points is not amazing. Next slide. By comparison, the village of Schaumburg got a 40 rating. So if you're as curious about these kinds of things as I am, we'd like to invite you to this webinar and learn more about it and what does make a great cycling city. One more slide, Julie. So without further ado, let me turn the microphone over, so to speak, to John and Ralph. Once again, John Pucher is Professor Emeritus at Rutgers University in the School of Urban Planning. And Ralph Buehler is also a professor and a department chair in the areas of urban planning and policy. So, gentlemen, take it away.
Thank you very much, Melody. For those of you who are listening in, Melody and I have communicated with each other many, many, many times over the years. And so it's a special pleasure that Melody is serving as MC. Well, first of all, both Ralph and I would like to thank Chicagoland's Active Transportation Alliance for inviting us to give this presentation. We thank the staff of ATA for hosting our talk. And we also thank all the members of ATA for supporting its crucial advocacy work on behalf of cycling, walking, and other forms of active transportation. We also thank ATA's affiliated governmental and non-governmental organizations for all they have been doing to promote safe and convenient cycling for all Chicagolanders. Finally, Ralph and I would like to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to participate in this webinar on cycling for sustainable cities. With Chicago Bike Week coming up from June 25th to July 2nd, we hope that our talk will help kick off all the fun events during your bike week. And now just a little bit about me. My name is John Pucher. And for the past 4 decades, almost all of my research over the past 4 decades has involved international comparisons of urban transportation. And that sort of helps explain the international scope of this new book of ours, Cycling for Sustainable Cities. And I've always felt that we can learn a lot from other countries about how to improve urban transportation here in North America, especially when it comes to public transit, walking, and cycling, the topic of our new book and of this presentation. It was my 3 years on sabbatical professor at the University of Munster, Germany. Now, this is not a small city, 250,000 people. 40% of all trips there are by bike. Everyone gets around by bike. even the police and the mail service. And 2 years that I spent in the 1980s in Munster, Germany, really inspired my love of cycling and also motivated my cycling research for the past 25 years. Now over to Ralph.
Good evening from me as well. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ralph Buehler. I'm professor and chair of urban affairs and planning at Virginia Tech. My main research is on the determinants of travel. So I study how people get around and how they make the choice to walk, to ride bikes, to ride public transport, or to drive. And then importantly, what the implications are of these choices for the environment, the economy, and equity. Most of my research is also international comparative, because I believe that cities, countries can learn from each other to make countries and cities more livable and the transport system more sustainable. And that already gets us to the book, which is a international collaboration with over 40 experts in bicycling from 5 continents in different areas of transportation. We have planners, we have engineers, we have geographers, and we have public health experts, and we're lucky enough to bring them all together in this book. Now you should already be able to see the cover slide here that shows you the title of the book, which is Cycling for Sustainable Cities, and the main impetus of the book is how to find out how to make city cycling safe and convenient for everyone. And the title slide already shows you how this can be done, or what elements of this are. These are separate bikeway infrastructure, bicycle public transport integration, providing cycling for everyone, men and women, children and adults, people of all races and ethnicities. The next slide here shows you the cover of the book, and it's the same theme there. You can see truly mass cycling on the cover picture. That's why we chose it, from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And this is not an event or anything. This is just daily mass cycling, often for utilitarian purposes. And you can see people are cycling in everyday clothes and with normal bikes. Some bicycles are special to carry cargo or transport cargo. You can see that there are men as there are women. And of course, you can also see the green light on the right-hand side here for bicycles. In the following slides, I'll take you briefly through the content of the book. And then we'll really dive into this presentation and just give the overview of the book to give you a sense of what's in the book, because we cannot cover everything in the presentation today. So the book starts with where John and I sort of set the scene with trends of bicycling internationally in different countries and different cities. And we demonstrate how sustainable bicycling is. And after that, we have chapters that focus on important specific topics of bicycling, starting with bicycling and public health, of course, the safety of bicycling and bikeway infrastructure, so that everybody can ride and will ride. This is followed by a chapter on bicycle parking, which is very important because bicycles are parked most of the time. Then we look at programs and policies that are non-infrastructure but are very important to promote bicycling. The next chapter evaluates bike policies and bike projects. It addresses the question, how do we choose projects, which ones to fund, which ones not to fund? The next 2 chapters look at technology and bicycling. One chapter is written by experts on e-bikes, looking at Europe and North America. And the next one is written by experts on bike sharing and its evolution and expansion mainly in Europe and in North America. The next chapters focus on special groups of cyclists, starting with women and cycling, followed by children and cycling, and then older adults and bicycling. And this group of chapters is sort of rounded out by a chapter focusing on social justice or equity and bicycling, which, by the way, is also a theme that carries through the book through all the chapters. So we asked all the chapter authors to include aspects of social justice and equity in their chapter. After that, we have a series of case studies, first starting with case studies of countries and entire continents, first looking at China and India, the 2 largest countries in the world, and bicycling there, followed by bicycling in Latin America. And then we have city case studies. First, the mega cities, New York, London, and Paris in comparison. Then the big European cycling cities, Copenhagen and Amsterdam compared, followed by 2 cities compared that don't have a cycling history, Portland, Oregon, and Sevilla in Spain. We then have an important chapter on bicycling advocacy, which is very important to make things happen on the ground and to lobby We compare that in Europe, North America, and Australia. And in the end, John and I bring it together with sort of lessons for more sustainable transport and more sustainable cycling.
As you might guess from the title of the book, we believe, and I think all of the authors of our book believe, that cycling is an extraordinarily sustainable means of transportation, especially getting around cities. And there's three aspects of this. Cycling is environmentally very sustainable, no pollution, very little in the way of non-renewable resources that are used. It's economical, it's low in cost, both for the individual, but also for the government. It costs much less to build even a protected bike lane or any sort of a bike facility compared to building additional lanes of a road, or it's even much more, it's much less expensive than public transit as well. I'm in favor of public transit too, but another aspect of the economical sustainability, as there have been studies that in fact show that the health benefits of cycling so far outweigh the potential risks of injury in a crash, that there are big economic benefits in terms of reduced health costs for society as a whole. Probably the least obvious of the aspects of sustainability is the social sustainability. We mean by this that it's cycling is financially affordable by almost everybody. Cycling itself, that is pedaling your bike, certainly is affordable. And you can get a bike that doesn't have to cost thousands of dollars. It can be $200 or $300. You can get a fairly good bike. It's physically possible for almost everybody. There's going to be groups, perhaps very old or people with certain disabilities who can't bike, but for the most part, it's physically possible for everyone. And the other aspect specifically of social sustainability, normally the physical, the mental, and the social health benefits of physical activity are also an aspect of social sustainability. And that chapter we have is chapter 3, I think it is, by the 4 professors of public health. And the physical benefits, the health benefits are sort of obvious, but what really blew me away was just how extraordinarily important the mental and the social health benefits of cycling are. Well, looking at this overall, so it's environmentally, economically, socially sustainable, you could say cycling is just a perfect mode of transportation. In fact, it's divine. How do you like? I took this photograph when I was in Germany in the 1980s, and this is the way the nuns got around Münster, Germany. Well, for cycling being divine, such a divine means of transportation, isn't it surprising that only about 1 or 2% of trips are made by bike in English-speaking countries? I'm not sure what the English language has to do with keeping people off of bikes, but it seems to be the case. If you look at the United States, Australia, Canada, the UK, and by the way, Ireland is roughly 2% as well. It's like, what's going on there? Don't they see how divine, how perfect, how sustainable cycling is? As soon as you cross the continent, you cross the channel over to Europe and you have much higher levels of cycling as a percentage of all trips. So for example, Austria is 6%, Norway is 5%, Germany is 11%, Sweden 9%. You go all the way to the top here. It's 28%, so almost a third of all trips by bike in the Netherlands, and then Denmark 14%, and we have squeezed in there, and between all these European countries, we have Japan, which is 13% of all trips by bike, and it's 17% in Greater Tokyo. So it's really an important way of getting around Japanese cities, that's for sure. And it's not, some of you might think, well, maybe it's the reason is that in the United States and Canada and Australia, that the fairly new countries that mostly developed during the automobile era, that we have lots of sprawl, we have long trip distances, many trips being too long to make by bike. But as it turns out, and I don't mean to confuse you because I'm going to then contradict something here, but over 40% of all trips in American metropolitan areas are 2 miles or shorter. Let me just repeat that. 40% of all trips in American metropolitan areas, and that includes Chicago, are 2 miles or shorter. That's a very easy distance to cover by bike. But then, we only have 1% of all trips by bike in American cities, and it's a little bit higher in Canada. But anyway, this particular graphic shows you something else. It says it's not just a matter of trip distance, although it is true that average trip distances are longer in the United States than they are in these European countries. But that's not the real main difference, because what we did in this graphic is we controlled for trip distance. And you can see for every single trip distance category that in the United States and also in the UK, you have levels of cycling, 1%. And so even in that trip category, under trips of 2 miles or shorter, you have only 2% of all of those trips made by bike. And it's sort of, well, how in the world can that be? Then you look at Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, and you've got, it depends on exactly which distance you're talking about, maybe 15% of all trips in Germany. You have about maybe 25% of all in Denmark, about 35% of all trips in the Netherlands, sort of averaging over the bottom two categories. So the point of this is simply controlling for trip distance, looking at share of trips within each distance category. Even then, the United States and also the UK has really a very, very small percentage of trips by bike. The good news is, so it's not all bad though, even looking at cities in North America, Australia, and of course in Europe as well, but even cities that have very little in the way of a cycling culture, cycling history, those bracketed right here, there has been over the past, say, 30 years, since about 1990, a big increase in the percentage of trips by bike. They're still low relative to Europe, relative to countries like, cities rather, like Amsterdam and Copenhagen. Melody at the beginning mentioned that Chicago wasn't exactly stellar in its comparisons, but still look at the increase. That's a 6-fold increase from 0.3% in 1990 to 1.8% in 2017. And you can see really big increases, 2 to 10-fold, going to Seville, Spain, Vienna, Austria, Portland, Boca. None of these cities had any kind of a history or culture of cycling, and yet over the past 3 decades have vastly increased the amount of cycling. If you look at the cities to the right, those 4 are Berlin, Munich, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, especially Copenhagen, Amsterdam. What's really impressive to me there is, okay, they started out at a much, much higher level, but they managed to increase significantly the amount of cycling even from that high level. You might think, oh, you're going to reach a limit. You can't get any higher than this, but just look at Amsterdam. I mean, going from, what is it, 21% to 37% or something like that. Big, big increases, very impressive. And the next slide, it really sort of reinforces in another way what I said for the first slide, and that is the largest percentage growth has been in those cities without a cycling tradition that started off with very low levels of cycling. So Chicago, here we have a 6-fold increase, 500%. Seville, Spain, 1,400% increase. Or Bogota, Colombia, 1,000%, and so forth and so on. Buenos Aires is what, 800%, and in New York and so forth. The point is that the cities are more to the right of this graph, which had very little of a cycling tradition, very little history of cycling. Those cities are where you got the largest growth percentage-wise.
And we saw a little bit of the potential of bicycling during the COVID pandemic. And it's not in the book, but it's a paper we recently did. And we looked at the impacts of COVID on bicycling. And the lines you see here are organized by week. They go from left to right of the year 2020. And it compares the cycling level in 2020 to the cycling level in 2019. If you're above the line labeled 0 here, you have more cycling in that week in 2020 than in 2019. And overall, we come out with increases in cycling in most of these countries. Of course, we see lots of variability during the year. We also see very notably this big dip around week 14, 15, 16, 17. And this is when those countries had very severe lockdowns. So people, mainly in Europe, were not allowed to leave their homes unless they had a very specific purpose written on a piece of paper. And people are really in a very severe lockdown. We had drops of all sorts of travel, but also of bicycling during that. And once the lockdowns were lifted, cycling, as you can see here, jumped or skyrocketed again. In this study, we overall found increases in cycling volumes and in the percentage of trips made by bicycling. Even in cities where cycling didn't increase, other trips, transit trips and driving trips dropped so much that the share of trips by bicycling that was left increased. As you already saw by week, there was lots of variation by month, even by time of day, by location, and by trip purpose in the trends of cycling. In generally, we found increases for exercise, recreational cycling, getting outdoors and relieving stress. So people wanted to be out. We saw these increases in the afternoons and the early evenings. And we saw the largest increases on the weekends, so larger than the increases we saw during the week. And if we look at facilities, the biggest increases were on off-road recreational paths. On the other hand, we saw decreases in the morning peak hour. So these were the people who were working from home or going to school from home, and they were no longer commuting to work. And we see that in the daily distribution of trips. We also saw decreases in utilitarian cycling. Again, the work trips, the trips to school, the trips to university that were not happening. And we saw these, as on the slide before, these deep decreases during lockdowns and increases in cycling after the lockdowns. Many cities responded to the COVID pandemic and the increased cycling by transforming the streets and accommodating cyclists. This is a very impressive example, the Rue de Rivoli, one of the main roads in the center of Paris in France. And it was sort of converted into a bicycling street. On the side here, we still have a bus lane, but most of this street, which used to be a car street, is now a bicycle street. Similarly, the city of Montreal in Canada installed about 70 kilometers of new improved cycling facilities in 2020, and most of them to a very high standard. You can see one of them here with the bollards here, a protected bike lane, two-directional travel, and entire families are out there and feel comfortable cycling. Other cities responded, and the examples here are including Chicago, but mainly from the Boston area, with different measures. There were road closures, mainly in residential areas where only residents were allowed to drive in, or those who had to deliver something, and they gave the streets to pedestrian cyclists, joggers, inline skaters. There were also entire streets that were completely closed off, maybe in parks or close to parks, where there was no car traffic at all. Many cities reconfigured their outdoor eating to have dining on the former parking spaces or former roadway. And they built additional bike lanes around that. In this case, we have the eating area here, a bike lane next to it, a one-way car travel lane here, and then next to the yellow lines here, we have a contraflow bike lane. Here you see an example of what happened in many cities. This is a street in Boston before July 2020. They then put in a pop-up bike lane with these orange traffic cones there, and many cyclists used it. And as a result, this facility was made permanent and is now a permanent cycle track. Similar story here from Beach Avenue in Vancouver. They saw, as you see the traffic cones here, very popular, over 10,000 bicyclists on several days in the summer, and now converted to a protected bike lane with a concrete curb, and still very, very popular.
Well, we devoted an entire chapter to cycling in Latin American cities, and we have three Latin American colleagues, all professors of transportation and city planning, who worked on this chapter together. There's no national data on cycling or any urban travel behavior actually in Latin America, but they collected a database. They've been working on it for about 15 years now, and it's city database, so it's data on transportation for various cities. And what you see here is huge variation from roughly 0% of trips by bike in Valparaiso, but even in Quito and in Lima, which are big cities, almost nothing, 0.3% of trips by bike. And then we'll go way over to the right part of the scale, and you see 8.3% in Guadalajara, Mexico. You can see about almost 7% in Bogota, other cities, Santiago de Chile, almost 4%, and Buenos Aires, 3.5%. So anyway, big variation among cities. And by the way, we just thought it was really important to include a special chapter on Latin America, because as it turns out, there's 650 million people living in Latin America, and that's more than the number of people living in North America, which is 450 million. That puts Mexico, we sort of excluding Mexico, putting that in Latin America, that makes that difference. So it's a really important place and a lot of people living and lots of interesting things going on, including ciclovías, by the way, which originated in Latin America. We also have an entire chapter devoted to bicycling in China and India. It's a rather sad story in China, I must say. I had 3 Chinese co-authors of this chapter, plus 1 Indian co-author. And it's a very sad story because you have a quite dramatic decline in cycling in almost all actually, Chinese cities. And it's even larger than you see here, sort of that, I guess you call it dark teal, which is a third of the bars for each of these cities is the latest year. And in every single case, it's fallen. And it's fallen even more than is shown in the graphic because e-bikes are included for most cities in these statistics. And unfortunately in China, as we found out, about 90% of e-bikes now in China are not pedelecs. They are basically e-scooters. There's not even pedals on them. So these dark teal lines for the latest years are really even lower than they look, or that's shown in the graphic. There's a number of reasons for the big decline in cycling in China. One is big increases in per capita income over the past 2 or 3 decades in China. And as a result, big increases, massive increases in car ownership and use. Also massive government investment in roadway infrastructure and superhighways. They now have actually a network of superhighways, sort of like interstate highways. It's larger than the network we have in the United States. They really can build things very fast in China. But on top of that, all of these cities are really very big cities, but these cities, I think it's now 6 of the 10 largest metro systems in the world are in China. And the government invested massively in improved and massively expanded metro systems, but also bus rapid transit systems, improved public transit overall. So you have both. You have lots more competition to cycling because you have much better public transit facilities, and you also have lots more cars and more roadway infrastructure. The other issue is it's become sort of a stigma issue, and that is that if you're riding a bike, it's now seen as being, well, that's sort of lower income, and there's a sort of a stigma attached to that. The last issue for the reason for the decline in cycling, that is these cities have been growing like crazy. I mean, doubling, tripling in size, not just in the number, but also in the extent, the area of these cities. And that means that the average trip distance has also increased, and that's made it more difficult to cover trips by bike as opposed to, say, public transportation or other means. So the central government of China wants to reverse this trend, and they're providing some funding to help reverse it. They're encouraging cities to introduce programs to restore cycling infrastructure, but it's going to be a long haul. One thing I'll just note before we go to India, and that is there's no cycling gender gap in China. As many men as women cycle. So that's not an issue the way it is in, for example, the United States. It's also an issue, by the way, the gender gap in India, while we're on that topic. There's a humongous gender gap in India. About 6 or 7 times more men cycle in India than women. And the reason for that is there is sort of a stigma attached to women on bikes in India, but perhaps more importantly, that women are afraid to get on bikes because of both physical and verbal sexual harassment, which is a big problem in Indian cities. The other issue is cycling in India is very dangerous. So that's probably another reason why there's so little cycling by women in India. But overall, the main point of this slide is we have about 20%, roughly 20% of all trips in Indian cities are by bike. That's a high percentage. That is higher than the percentage we had in Denmark. And we think of Denmark as being a very high percentage for bike trips. But this is 20%. It's higher than it is in Denmark. And there's not much difference. You might be surprised. The percentage is 22% in rural areas. It's 18% in urban areas. And then what this slide is showing here is if you look at these various population size categories for Indian cities, it's almost constant 20% until you get to 2 million. So you have like 20% of trips by bike until 2 million. And then when you get to the bigger cities, so between 2 and 5 million, it goes down to 16%. And when you go to 5 million plus, it goes down to 9%. So it's in the biggest cities where you have the least cycling. But even then, 9% of trips is quite a bit, more than in Chicago. Among the largest cities, and these are the largest cities in India, huge variation. Just take the top three. These are the three largest cities in India: Mumbai, Delhi, and Kolkata. And you'll see that in Kolkata you have, I think it's 12 times as many, the percentage share of trips by bike is about 12 times higher in Kolkata than it is in Mumbai. Delhi's in the middle at 11. And you might wonder, why is this? Well, it turns out Mumbai is the financial capital of India, and it has the highest per capita income of any of these cities. In addition to that, Mumbai has India's best public transportation system, and Kolkata has one of the worst. It has a really bad, outmoded, just really bad public transportation system. Yet another reason is the nature of, I guess you call the geography of Mumbai. It's on a peninsula. It means you have very long trip distances for commuting, especially by the middle class. And so you have cycling is for many trips, it's just not an option. Whereas in Kolkata, you have shorter trip distances, you have a street, more of a grid street pattern, you have a fine network of streets, and that facilitates cycling as well. So that's the story of India. And by the way, China and India are really important. I think that combined, I guess there are over 3 billion residents in those two countries. So they certainly have more cyclists than any other countries in the world. Okay, Ralph.
So if we want to promote cycling, we have to promote it for everyone. And that starts as promoting cycling for all ages. And as these pictures show here, we can cycle from a very young age into older age. Sometimes we may need special bicycles with a third wheel, as we see there with the children cycling, but we can also have special bikes for adults, and they can even help you carry cargo or carry groceries and other things. And of course, you can cycle for utilitarian purposes to get somewhere, or you can just cycle to go for a ride and get exercise and get outside. Cycling varies by age group in most countries. And in all of the countries shown here, the percentage of daily trips made by bike is greater for the age group that's not at driving age yet. So for all countries, the youngest age group we show here has the highest percentage of trips made by bike. Once they get to driving age, it drops. But what we see here is in the US and in the UK, it drops with increasing age, and less than 1% of trips by the 70-plus-year-olds are made by bicycle. In the other countries, after we have the initial drop at driving age, bicycling doesn't decline that much. In Japan, it stays around 12%. In Germany, it stays around 10%. In Denmark, it goes down to around 10. And then in the Netherlands here, it stays around 25% of trips. And if you look at the oldest age group, the 70-plus-year-olds, we have between 10 and 23% of trips made by bike. So 1/4 of the trips by those 70 years and older in the Netherlands are made by bicycles. So you can clearly continue riding into older age. So it's a big difference between countries in the share of bike trips made by women. In Australia, the UK, the US, and Canada, only between 1/4 and 1/3 of all bike trips are made by women, compared to the other countries here where we have about parity, about 50%, half of all bike trips are made by women. And in countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, and Japan, it's even a higher share of trips by women than by men. And this is also what this picture shows and what the cover of the book shows. Over 50% of bike trips in Denmark and the Netherlands are made by women. Another important trend the book identifies is the growth in e-bike sales in Europe and in the US. And most of the bikes here are pedelecs. So these are electric bikes that have a battery. And when you pedal, you can set at different levels, you get support from the electric motor. They've been increasingly important. Our data end in 2018, but more recent trends, especially during COVID, show strong increase, further increase in e-bike sales, and mainly in these pedelecs. There are different classes of e-bikes, they are called. There are some that only go 20 miles per hour. There are others that go up to 28 8 miles per hour, and the chapter discusses that.
Cycling safety is absolutely crucial in getting people on bikes. And that's especially true for anyone who's risk averse, and that includes me. It's also true for older adults. That includes me as well. I'm 70 years old. It's important for the young because parents are not going to let their kids bicycle anywhere, let alone to school, unless they think it's safe. And it turns out that women, when they're asked in surveys or when you observe behavior, are much more sensitive than men are to safety. So that for all of these groups, if you want to get the young cycling, the older adult cycling, people with disabilities cycling, anyone who's risk averse, and women cycling, you're going to have to improve cycling safety. And if you look at the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany, one of the reasons that all of those groups that we just mentioned there do in fact ride bikes at very high rates is probably due to the much greater safety of cycling in those three countries, Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany. This is another graph which shows the relationship between levels of cycling, here it's kilometers cycled per person per year, and the cycling dangers, cyclist fatalities per 100 million kilometers cycled, or per amount cycled. And the United States does the worst. We have the least cycling and the most dangerous cycling. The Netherlands does the best, the most cycling and the safest cycling. And you can see there's a fairly clear relationship here between these two things. The safer cycling is, the more people are willing to cycle, but then also the more people who are out there cycling, the safer cycling becomes. This is the phenomenon that's called safety in numbers. And there's sort of a number of reasons for this, and that is the more cyclists who are out there, including riding on streets without facilities, the more visible cyclists become. And visibility is absolutely key to cycling safety. It's key actually to traffic safety of any kind, being visible. The other thing is the more people who are cycling, the more likely that motorists are also at some time going to be cyclists. That's certainly the case in the Netherlands. There's hardly a motorist in the Netherlands who is not also a cyclist, which means you're more sensitive to the needs of cyclists and avoiding the endangerment of cyclists. And the third reason is the more cyclists you have, the more public and political support you have for improved cycling facilities. So this is a very important relationship, I think. And what you see here is in most of the countries in this slide, even this part of the time in the United States, we've had an improvement in cycling safety. And here we have cyclist fatality rates, again, per 100 million kilometers cycled, and we compare this over time. And these are three different time periods. And you can see that, I mean, especially in the UK, Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, you have dramatic increases in cycling safety. So in the UK, 3 times safer in the latest period than the first period. So roughly, we're talking about almost 20 years span of time. Then cycling becomes 3 times safer in the UK, twice as safe in Germany, more than twice as safe for Denmark, maybe 70% safer in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, in the United States, there was an improvement in the first 2 time periods from 7.2 to 4.5, but then it went up, it reversed from 4.5 to 6.0. Why? That's a bad trend. And by the way, this is not just the fluke and the statistics that we were using, or were we using a particular set of statistics that showed this. Every single study I've ever seen, and there's many different sources of statistics, show this is a real, genuine problem in the United States. Increasing fatality rates and serious injury rates over the past 10 years or so for both cyclists and pedestrians, by the way. Well, why? Number one is over this period, there's been a significant increase in motor vehicle miles traveled. So more vehicles out there, and they are the main source of danger for cyclists as well as for pedestrians, by the way. The other issue is a big, for me, surprising, but a huge increase in the percentage of personal vehicles that are either SUVs or pickup trucks or minivans, basically light trucks. And when I say pickup trucks, these are mega pickup trucks. These are muscle trucks. They're all over here in North Carolina, where I am right now. And they have larger fronts, they have higher fronts, and there's a number of studies that show this. These larger personal vehicles in the United States, and they've increased, by the way, from about 50% of sales to 75% of sales. Big increase in this. That's what surprised me, that there was a sudden jump over the past 10 years or so. It's really much more dangerous. Any crash between one of these larger personal vehicles and a pedestrian or a cyclist, and you're much more likely to get a serious injury or death of the cyclist or pedestrian. The other issue here is distracted driving. It's texting while driving, using your cell phone while driving, and being drunk while driving, which is, as it turns out, something that I don't know why it surprised me, but there was a survey that compared levels of drunk driving in each of these 5 countries, and we were 3 times worse than any of these other countries. I'm thinking, what is wrong with us? I usually don't drive when I'm drunk, but I guess some people do. So anyway, it's a real big problem, and at least not nearly enough is being done in the United States to increase cycling safety. We have a chapter on New York, London, and Paris. None of these cities had any history of cycling. They just didn't have that tradition. These cities were all based on walking and public transit. That's just the way you got around in these 3 big cities, mega cities, really. And so you have very, very low initial levels of cycling in all 3 of these cities. And then they all invested in more and more cycling infrastructure and policies, including bike sharing, for example, to promote cycling. And you see a big increase in levels of cycling. So in New York, you have almost a 4-fold increase. In London, you have a doubling. In Paris is the champion here, a 12-fold increase in the percentage of trips by bike in Paris. So big, big increases. And this sort of confirms one of the previous graphs I was showing you, and that is in all 3 of these cities, which had increased cycling considerably over this time period, big decreases both in fatality rates and in serious injury rates relative to levels of cycling. So in New York, it goes from 69 to 19 in terms of serious injury rates, goes from 28 to 12 in terms of fatalities, but all of these cities getting safer and safer. And again, Paris is the champion. It has the lowest here in terms of fatality rates, as 3 compared to 9 in London, I'm sorry, 7 in London and 12 in New York. So again, there's this, the safer cycling, it goes in both directions. The safer cycling has led to more cycling to safer cycling. And this is one of the key strategies that has been implemented, especially over the past 10, 15 years in these 3 cities. And now currently on a massive scale. I mean, this is now the key strategy in these 3 cities for getting more people on bikes and for making cycling safer. Because I don't think you can trust motorists. Those of you who are motorists, and I guess it's most people, will hate me for this, but I just don't trust motorists to respect the rights of cyclists. I like the idea of physical separation when possible. And you can see this is the case in all 3 of these cities, obviously Big Ben and Eiffel Tower. And this in New York, that's 8th Avenue looking south. And you can see not only is it physically separated between intersections, but at intersections, there are special advanced green lights for cyclists. There are turn restrictions for cars. So one of the big problems at intersections is left or right turning motor vehicles who then run into both cyclists and pedestrians. Actually, it's a big problem. So getting an advanced green light helps a lot. So this is a really important measure. And as I say, it's being implemented now. All 3 cities have committed themselves to massive increases in these sorts of separate cycling facilities.
So how do we encourage more cycling while improving the safety? And it turns out there's a package of policies. In this talk, we focus on the first 2, but there's a whole group of policies that need to be implemented. John alluded already to the better cycling facilities, but also traffic calming of residential neighborhoods where cyclists can share the roadway with lower volumes and slower moving motor vehicles, mixed use zoning to keep trip distances short enough, improved urban design to increase safety and access, but also, of course, integrating bicycling with public transport as first mile, last mile option, or as an alternative option if you have mechanical failure or bad weather or what else there could be. importantly, restrictions on motor vehicles in terms of speed, the cost of driving, parking availability, etc. Improve traffic education, both for motorists and also for cyclists. Traffic regulations to protect cyclists and enforcement of them. And of course, special events and other promotional campaigns to make cycling more attractive. This graph here shows you for about 20 cities in Europe, South America, North America, and in Australia, how they expanded their bicycling facilities. So the first graph shows the percentage growth in their bikeway network. The next bar here shows you their growth in cycling. So all of these cities that have increased their networks have also increased the cycling levels. And then importantly, all of the cities have seen a decline in fatalities and severe injuries of cyclists relative to the cycling levels. So all of these cities have made cycling safer over time. One of the key measures to make cycling safer are so-called cycle tracks or protected bike lanes. This is the trend here in the US, from 55 in 2006, 55 miles to 684 miles. And we've seen more recent data now, but the book ends in 2018. The growth has increased in these facilities. So this is a 14-fold increase alone in the time frame we show here. What do these cycle tracks look like? They look a little bit different in different places. In the upper left, we see it in Copenhagen. Typically, if you glance through here to the back next to cars, you have a little curb that separates the cycle track from the roadway. Then you have another little curb that separates the cycle track from the pedestrians. At intersections, the cycle track is carried through in these bright blue colors to alert the driver to the presence of a cyclist in the right of way of cyclists there. In Bogota, Colombia, here we have a two-directional cycle track with these caps. They're called these yellow barriers that do not allow cars to easily get into the cycle track. Montreal is the city in North America with the longest history of a network of protected bike lanes. There they use these little concrete curbs, as we see here to the left, to protect the cyclists. And then here on the right in Seville in Spain, they have put up a fence to separate cyclists from motorized traffic on the cycle tracks.
Ralph, stay with the slide for just 1 second, please. Go back. I want folks to look at Copenhagen on that picture. Look at that poor man. He's totally outnumbered by women. This is a typical scene in Denmark. More than, I think it's 56, 57% of trips, bike trips, are by women in Copenhagen. He doesn't seem to mind it, but he looks a little bit sort of intimidated. Go ahead.
These are similar pictures of protected bike lanes from Sydney and Brisbane in Australia. Again, we have the cycle track separated from motorized traffic, in this case, not only with a curb, but also with planters and with greenery. Also up here we see, and we see in a second a little bit more, we have a bridge that's for bicycles, and the bridges are very important. They're often the only way for cyclists to cross rivers or to cross highways. And if these bridges do not contain facilities for cyclists, or if there's no bike bridge, you cannot cross this bridge easily, and it sort of limits the bikeway network. A new trend in bikeways are these bicycle expressways. Sometimes they're called bicycling highways. The examples we've chosen here are from Germany and from China. The upper left in Germany, we see how these work. They're typically separated from pedestrian traffic. And then importantly, at intersections, they do not meet the car traffic at grade. So there's either always a bridge or there is a tunnel. This has two main advantages. One is it speeds up the bike trip because you don't have to wait at an intersection. And the second is it makes it much safer because you're never crossing high volumes and high speeds of car travel. On the left here in Freiburg, they have used the sign in Germany that's used for the Autobahn. It's a blue sign, and the Autobahn is the highway network where you on many stretches you can drive as fast as you like in your car. And they're using the same symbols, but for bicycles here to indicate this is sort of your bicycle expressway. And they extend way into the hinterlands and go into the city. The others here from Germany work similarly. We included the one from Beijing in China. And this is one of the measures to counter the drop in cycling that John had alluded to, are elevated bikeways. So this is a bikeway that's above the city in Beijing, allowing cyclists to ride above the city and not interact with vehicular traffic. And we'll see an example of an important bridge in Chicago in a minute. We have some of these facilities here in the US as well. We have the Cherry Creek Trail, for example, in Denver, that on some stretches has a separation of pedestrians and cyclists. We have the Midtown Greenway in Minneapolis that separates pedestrians to the right hand of this white line and cyclists to the left. But we also have shared use facilities like the Minuteman Trail in Boston. Of course, you also have great facilities there in Chicago. This is the Lakefront Trail, 18 miles long, more than 100,000 users on a typical summer weekend, and also separating pedestrians and cyclists on that facility. And then what I alluded to before, a very important connection here in Chicago, a flyover that connects north and south segments of the Lakefront Trail and avoids congested intersections and dangerous intersections at Grand and Illinois Avenue. So bridges can be very important. Another protected bike lane, this time on Milwaukee Avenue, which is the busiest cycling street in Chicago. We see some of the elements that we talked about from the other countries. Here we see the concrete curb and the separation from the motorized traffic. The trend now in many cities goes away from just focusing on the links of the network, that's what we call it, to focusing also on intersections and redesigning intersections to make them safe for cyclists. And this is sort of a Dutch import to Salt Lake City that we see here on a Google map. And I'll explain briefly how this Dutch safety intersection works. The key elements are these safety islands that we marked here. And so if a motorist starts and wants to make a right-hand turn, they have to go fairly far into the intersection, the turning radius is changed, and they have to turn fairly steeply into the road. The effect this has is it slows down the motorist. And if a crash were to happen with a cyclist who starts here, the crash would be at a slow speed. There would be less severe injuries or fatalities wouldn't happen. And because the motorist is slower and the motorist goes out further into the intersection, there's a longer time where cyclists and motorists can see each other and can sort of avoid a conflict. In addition, the crossing distance here for the cyclist is shorter, so there is less distance. They are in the line of motor vehicle traffic. Once the bikes have come across, they can continue straight, of course, or they queue here for the next green light to make a left-hand turn. This graph here shows you the bikeway network of a grown cycling city. This is Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Everything in red here are bikeways and bike lanes. If you squint, you can see some elements like down here in orange, which are elements they are planning to build or they will still build. This is a truly connected network. On top of that, you have traffic calming, and John will talk about that in a minute, on neighborhood streets where cyclists can share the roadway with low levels of car travel and slow moving car travel. And keep in mind, Amsterdam is not the best cycling city in the Netherlands. Actually, many people you talk to from the Netherlands will tell you that Amsterdam is quite bad compared to other great cycling cities. Many cities worldwide are following the example of Dutch cities with bikeway networks. Here we have the example of Portland, Oregon on top, where we see their bikeway network in 1990 with the black lines, and the color in the back shows you the share of bike commuters. And the more this color will turn red, yellow and red, the higher the share of bike commuters. On the bottom, we have Sevilla in Spain and their bikeway network in green in 2005. Advancing one time period, 10 years here in Portland, we see how much their bikeway network has grown and how cycling levels have increased. And then in truly remarkable, in Spain and Sevilla, in only 3 years, they've greatly advanced their network of separated cycle tracks. Advancing the next time period, 4 more years in Portland, again, the bikeway network has grown much more dense and bike commuting levels have increased in these 14 years a lot. And then 10 years more here in Seville, where they have greatly expanded their bikeway network again.
Traffic calming is crucial because it's motor vehicles that kill most pedestrians and cyclists. I mean, that is most fatalities of cyclists, pedestrians are the result of crashes with motorists. And speed makes a huge difference. It's absolutely crucial to reduce motor vehicle speeds. And you'll see here that the likelihood of getting killed in a crash with a car increases exponentially once you go beyond 30 kilometers an hour, which is roughly, I think it's 19 miles an hour. I mean, it just goes up exponentially. And once you get to 50 kilometers an hour or 55, which is kilometers an hour, it's 35 miles an hour, which is not, that's the standard speed for residential neighborhoods here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and in many cities. And if you look at that, that's a 90% chance that a pedestrian or a cyclist is going to get killed in a crash with a motor vehicle at that speed. So I think the 30 kilometers an hour, because of this crucial relationship, has become the standard for traffic of European residential areas. And it's area wide that they do this. It's not just one street here or one street there. They do it both by reducing the speed limit to 30 kilometers per hour or less in super traffic calmed areas. I'll talk about that later. But also by physical measures that force cars to slow down. And again, I just don't trust motorists to respect my rights as a cyclist or a pedestrian. And I like these physical measures: road narrowing, zigzag routing, raised intersections, crosswalks, traffic circles, speed humps, bumps, and even lumps, as Ralph will show you later, mid-block closures, artificial dead ends, bulb outs, and so forth. Lots of physical infrastructure measures that force cars to slow down. This is
John, I'm just going to interrupt for a moment. We have, we're about 2 minutes till our time. That does not mean that you need to finish up or anything like that. I just wanted to acknowledge it for the folks that may have a hard stop at 7:30, but let's keep going.
okay. And remember,
everyone else, we are going to do Q&A at the end. John and Ralph are going to stick around to try and answer some of your questions. So if you want to enter something in the Q&A box, not in the chat, but in the Q&A, go ahead and we'll try and get to it when they're finished.
we'll stay as long as you'd like. So again, there's this 30 kilometer per hour speed limit. It's an area wide, not just isolated streets, so you can't sort of avoid traffic calm streets. It's just the through traffic just doesn't choose those streets at all. Street narrowing, in this particular case, it's in Freiburg, Germany, at both ends of the street. And it's not something that's seldom. 50 to 80% of residential streets in German and Dutch cities are traffic calmed in this way. In the Netherlands, 80% of all streets in the entire country are traffic calmed. It's a high percentage. An example of the traffic diverters I mentioned before, these examples are from Montreal and Quebec City, but you can see it makes through traffic impossible for motor vehicles, but you have these very convenient pass-throughs or cut-throughs for cyclists. And almost the same sort of a concept, but at a different sort of situation. And that is sort of what I call artificial dead ends. These used to be through streets for motor vehicles. And I lived in Sydney for an entire year, 2005, 2006. And these were all over the place. And the reason they were installed is because there was a lot of so-called rat running by motor vehicles. And it really, I mean, lots of pedestrians, especially children, were killed by motor vehicles through traffic going through residential neighborhoods. And so these were installed on lots of streets. As you can see, it's a cut through for pedestrians and cyclists. Forget it. It just totally cuts off through traffic for motor vehicles. I am showing this. You might wonder what's special about this. What's special about this is that there's nothing special about it. That is, many, I'm not sure that most, in fact, new residential developments in Germany look like this, and in the Netherlands as well. There's not even a sidewalk. It's a fully shared street. And the reason it can be fully shared is there's a speed limit of 7 kilometers an hour, which I guess is like 5 miles an hour. It's slow. And as you can see from the sign that indicates this sort of a neighborhood, that street is for everyone. It's for kids playing. It's for cyclists, it's for pedestrians, and it's for cars as well. But by law, the motorists must yield to the cyclist, the pedestrian, and the kids playing. And they're usually embodied within traffic calm neighborhoods. And now we get back to Chicago, your wonderful city, the Windy City. So this is your Glenwood Greenway in Chicago. And you can see, as often, many cities around North America sort of started off in Portland, but also in Vancouver. And they were originally called Vice Boulevards, but now they're all called Greenway, neighborhood greenways. And they're really expanding in cities throughout the continent. And what you have is a sort of a combination of things. You have sort of traffic calm streets, that is a reduction in speed limit. And you can see here on this street, it's 20 miles an hour, which is roughly 30 kilometers an hour. Here you have, in this one, a contraflow bike lane for one direction. And then you have the share road bike lane in the other direction. So it's a one-way street for cars, and it's a two-way street for cyclists.
And then here we have an example on how traffic calming can accommodate cyclists. These are speed lumps that are traffic calming measures, sort of making vehicles go over and slow down. This is our way to school, where I ride with my son every day. And what you see there is you have the bike lane between the speed lumps. In fact, the lump here on the left was not there in the beginning, and motorists, as John said, you cannot rely on them doing the right thing. They were going over the solid line here, and they were driving in the bike lane to go around the speed lump. So they had to install the second one. Another important element of bike promotion is the integration with public transport and, of course, bike parking. Integration with public transport takes two main forms. One is taking bikes on vehicles, like we see here in Minneapolis, bikes on buses. About 80% of all buses in the US now have these bike racks on them, so you can take bikes with you. Some transit systems also allow you to bring bikes on trains, but often only on special doors or during special hours, often off-peak. The second element of bike transit integration is parking. At train stations, here we have the bike parking garage of about 130 bikes in Washington, D.C. at Union Station. And then we have in the middle here, bike parking in Freiburg, Germany at the main train station, and in Groningen in the Netherlands. Bike parking at train stations can be for pay, but often if it is for pay, it is covered. There's an attendant and it's safe, so your bike cannot be vandalized. Even if it's not for pay, you'll have cover and you have protection from weather and for theft. We also have normal bike parking in cities, like here in Portland, the so-called bike corral, where they took out 2 car parking spots and put in 20 bicycle parking spaces. You can also have more fancy bike parking, like we see here in Nagoya, in Japan, where you sort of enter your bicycle into a machine. It takes, depending where it goes either underground or it goes above ground, parks your bike, and you can retrieve your bike in about a minute with a code, and it's for pay, but your bike comes out, and again, it's safe from weather and it's safe from vandalism and theft. There are many other measures that cities implement to promote cycling, and we don't have time to go into them, but they include, as John alluded already, ciclovías. These are events that can be for certain hours, an entire day, a weekend, or an entire week, where roadways are closed to motorized traffic and the entire space is given to cyclists, pedestrians, inline skaters, joggers, etc., and gives people a sense of what the place could be like if it were not used to move or park vehicles. Bike sharing has been very successful in attracting different users to riding bikes than bike owners. Often bike sharers do not want to own a bike because they don't want to care about the maintenance. They don't want to worry about the theft. Once you lock a bike in a bike share system, it's out of your hair. And it's very popular in cities where people do not have storage at home or live in apartments that only have stairs. So they don't have to worry about storing their bike at home. Businesses and cities have many programs to entice people to ride bikes, like Bike to Work Day that happens every year, or Bike to Work Week, or Bicycling Week, etc. There are many events to get people to ride bikes, have a good experience, and continue riding. Also, Bike to School Days. Of course, bike training is important. In the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, kids get bike training in school, in Washington, D.C. as well. In the US, and as a part of the curriculum, so every child has to get it. In many other schools in the US, it's voluntary, but learning how to ride a bike is very important. It's also important to train adults. Many adults, especially in countries with low cycling levels, may not have ridden for many, many years. They want to ride again. They don't feel fully comfortable. They don't remember all the traffic rules. So offering training for them is important. On the other end, of course, requiring motorists to learn about the rights of cyclists is very important in motorist training. There's a picture from the German driving test. There are many questions on it, requiring motorists to show that they know the rights to the road for bicyclists. It's also part of the on-road test. And then last, many cities are using something they copied from Copenhagen called bicycle accounts. These are annual, biannual, every 3-year surveys of cycling in the city. They capture the bikeway network, the condition of the network, trends in cycling safety, but they also may have survey elements where cyclists and residents of the city are asked about bicycling. How do you rate the safety of the bike system? How do you rate the condition of the bikeway network, et cetera? And then cities can use those to formulate policies. For example, they could say, we want to have at least a 4.5 out of 5 in rating of condition of bikeway infrastructure, et cetera. So these bicycle accounts are quite important for benchmarking.
Only 2 more slides, folks. Hang in there. We're almost finished. So implement really important. Professional planners, engineers, academics can have the best ideas in the world, but if you can't implement them, they're worthless. So it's really, really important to look at implementation strategies. One, let everyone know through the media, through every means you have, publicize both the individual and the societal benefits of cycling. Let people know you personally are going to benefit, health benefits, economic benefits, whatever, of cycling. And I think it's really, really important to involve citizens at all stages of planning and implementation. People don't want to be left out of the decision making. They want to feel like their needs, their perspectives are being valued and taken into account in deciding what kind of cycling facility and where should it be. If it's a controversial policy, then don't do it all at once. Do it in stages, or first as a trial and see if it works. And you just saw, we showed earlier in Boston and also in Vancouver. Those were trial projects. They were successful, so they were continued. They were very successful. Having bike plans, both long range and short range, combining incentives for cycling with disincentives for car use. A good disincentive for car use is reducing the speed limit, making through traffic impossible or very difficult in residential neighborhoods, reducing the supply of parking, making parking more expensive, and so forth. Also, this is one of the reasons that I think that the Chicagoland ATA is so important. All of the cycling advocacy groups are crucial in the United States because they coordinate sort of national, state, and local bike advocacy, and they can work together with politicians and other sustainability advocates to promote cycling. Because unless you can convince the public and politicians that cycling is good, something worth to be promoted, it's going to be very difficult to implement the necessary policies. And then, as Ralph mentioned before, benchmarking policies, to benchmarking reports to show progress over time. So last slide, and that is, on the one hand, cycling infrastructure is absolutely crucial. And it's easy to show pictures of that. It's much more difficult to show pictures all the other policies that go with it. But safe cycling infrastructure is necessary, absolutely, but it's not sufficient. You really need an integrated package of policies, programs to implement the cycling infrastructure. And we illustrated those parking and traffic calming and education and so forth. So combining the push factors for cycling with the like I said, we call it the carrots for cycling with the sticks, and I'd say big sticks for the motorists, if at all possible. And finally, we think cycling really, all the policies, programs, infrastructure ought to be with the intent of making cycling possible for everyone. As we noted in the very first slide, that should be the intent, not just for well-trained young men on fancy bikes that cost $5,000. That should be everyone, for men and women, all age groups, all abilities, various ethnic groups. And that's the way both the infrastructure and also the policies need to be designed. And the planning process itself has to explicitly prioritize the vulnerable people, of risk-averse parts of the population, and disadvantaged groups and marginalized groups at every stage. Okay, folks, that's it. Believe it or not, this is the book. So if you'd like to see more details, that's it. Thanks for hanging in there.
Oh, it was wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Julie, if you wouldn't mind throwing up the last couple of slides that we have to close out the conversation, and then we'll start the Q&A. So we wanted to let you all know that if you are interested in taking action on increasing and improving the cycling network in the city of Chicago, Active Trans has a current call to action. We've created a story map. You can go on to the next slide, and then we'll scoot back. We created a story map, which is a GIS type of software that depicts, Chicago's network, what's changed over the years, what's still missing, what we still want to do. It kind of talks about the level of cycling infrastructure in the various wards. And if you go back one slide, Julie, we are asking for 3 main things: to upgrade the existing bike network so that we have truly protected lanes in some places, and also to add 10 new miles to spoke routes and 30 miles of spoke route lanes and 10 miles of protected lanes by 2023 and 2026 respectively. So follow the link and you can take action. And then finally, Active Trans couldn't do any of this work if it were not for you all and our members and our supporters. So stick with us, become a member if you're not one, activetrans.org. We're always happy to welcome new people into the fold. And with that said, I think we can start facilitating some Q&A. I will start because I've been following this. There's a lot of good stuff in here. So right off the bat, let me say, those of you who are adding in little like resources and events and other webinars that are related to this topic, we are going to send a follow-up email to everybody who signed up for this, including the recording, as well as we will list all these great resources in there as well. So in case people are missing them or had to drop off early, we'll make sure that you get those. So there's a question that there are 2 questions related to the intersection between cycling and transit. One question from Randy Neufeld was asking if you noticed or knew of any transit and cycling intermodality that was happening in India and China. And then also in the US, did the availability of an intermodal trip, mixing cycling and transit, did that affect or influence people's decision as to whether to bike or not to bike?
Well, I can tell you for sure, in India, there is 0 bike transit integration, 0. I mean, absolutely none. There's almost no bike parking, and there's just a difficult transit situation, but even more, there's just very little, almost no cycling infrastructure in India. So there's the answer for India is no. In China, they actually have a lot of their bike sharing stations near or even floating bike sharing near metro stops, transit stops of one sort or another. I'm not sure of the number, but there is a lot of that. So a bicycle for sort of the last mile is definitely in Chinese cities. And they do have big metro systems, suburban rail systems, and so forth. So it's a really important question. And thank you, Randy, for Randy. It's been a long time. Randy, it's just good knowing you're here. That you're still alive like me.
Yeah, and for the bike transit integration, I mean, a paper, and you asked about the US, but a paper comes to mind from the Netherlands that really showed how much the bicycle and rail are integrated in commuting there, and even to the micro level of commuters making decisions to which train station to bike, and they go to the train station that is more in the direction of where they need to go, but also to the train station with the safer and better bike parking. But that's a high cycling country. Here in the US, we see that many transit systems increase bike parking around their stops, and also secure bike parking with bike boxes or with bike cages, where you can enter maybe with the same card that you use for the transit system or the metro system, where your bike is parked inside. We also see some efforts to integrate bike share with transit. Again, I see that more in European countries where these, in Germany, for example, the regional transit authorities, they include rail, buses, but also bikes and car sharing, by the way, into the same ticketing structure, into the same, and even with this, they're branded in the same color. But so as a first mile, last mile integration, we see the bike sharing quite a bit.
There's an interesting follow-on comment about intermodality in India, that there is intermodality, but it involves cycle rickshaws that are connected to apps that provide connections between metro stations and residential areas. Okay, so another question is, if you've seen, if you were to give Chicago some advice, where would you suggest they start amongst all the policies, all the infrastructure suggestions, all of the practices and programs? Do you think there are some things that are more important than others?
My suggestion is two things. Number one, on major arterials, the protected bike lanes are absolutely essential. Plus the intersection kind of treatments that Ralph showed for Salt Lake City. There's going to be certain intersections where I'll bet you anything, there are certain especially problematic intersections with a lot of injuries and potentially deaths. And they should have that sort of intersection treatment that Ralph showed. But I think on major arterials, the protected bike lanes is sort of the way to go. I think that in terms of residential areas, and that's most of the city, that is something that I think is neglected so much in American cities. I mean, whereas we have 80% of all streets in the entire Netherlands are traffic calmed at 30 kilometers or less. And in cities, I think Berlin, it's 80%. In Vienna, it's 80%. In Cologne, it's 50%. It varies from city to city, but I mean, most of the city's residential neighborhoods are traffic calmed. And it's like, I just don't understand why we don't get it here and it's not just Chicago, by the way. Here in Raleigh, it's like, you have to, I don't know, it's almost impossible to get neighbors with kids who are the biggest beneficiaries, by the way. I forgot to mention that with the traffic calming. All the studies have shown before and after, if you have a neighborhood traffic calm, the absolute biggest beneficiaries are children. That's the biggest drop in child fatalities, people with children who are either bicycling or walking. And I just don't understand why parents are not willing to just demand. So, and this is what the reason that we got that sort of form of traffic calming in Australian cities. I mean, I actually, since I did live there for a year, I asked some of the neighbors, well, how did this get installed? And it was almost always as a result of, well, there was a child who was killed here. There was constantly near misses or serious injuries. And that's really what, but the point is, the residential streets are just obvious. That's where you get most of the local cycling. That's certainly where most of the kids are going to cycle. They're not going to cycle to the center of the city. They're not going to have a long commute. And so making the residential streets safe, it also makes the neighborhood more pleasant, less noise, less air pollution. It makes the street part of public space that is almost like an extension of your front yard. And that's what they've been doing more and more in European cities.
Yeah, I want to second what John said, but add another dimension. And it's not in the book. We're just doing a study on Washington, D.C. and Frankfurt, Germany, in the very car-oriented cities that transform to more biking. And they attempt to do what John says. And they have bike plans with routes for protected bike lanes, with traffic calmed areas, etc. But both of them starting out noticed that they can't get there from where they were because of too much pushback. They couldn't take away car travel lanes immediately because there were too many drivers. There were not enough cyclists. They couldn't traffic calm everything immediately. And so what they chose is they had the bike plan, but then they said what was really important for them was within the city administration was for the bike planners to get integrated with all the other units in development, in engineering, in road maintenance. And by developing these relationships, the bike planners were able to include bicycling in everyday decision-making. And they were able to pick up on decisions that were coming down the pipeline. For example, one planner told me about a bridge that was redone. And they learned about the bridge. It was not in the bike plan, but they found out about the bridge through the relationships, and they could get bicycling in there early. And now they have a bike facility on the bridge. This bridge is going to be here for 50 years. If they wouldn't have had this relationship, the bridge would not have happened. So the point is, making bicycling part within the city administration of everyday decision-making when a road is repaved, when something is redone, when an intersection is looked at, also think about bicyclists. And then over time, as they increased the number of cyclists and got more support, they could go towards the taking away car parking lanes, taking away car travel lanes. But initially, they could not have gotten this. I think this process element, at least for these two cities, is also quite important to sort of integrate bike planning or bicycling considerations in everyday engineering, site review, and all sorts of other things.
That's exactly what happened in Portland. There's a chapter on Portland and Seville in the book, and it was really Roger Geller, who was the bike planner for Portland for many, many years, wrote that, co-authored that chapter. And it's just that's one of the key aspects. That's one of the key things that was done in Portland, that it wasn't just a separate bicycling department within DOT. It was the whole city administration was sort of integrated in terms of taking into account how can we facilitate and promote cycling.
Right. In amongst us advocates, we call that the complete streets philosophy, right? We've been trying to sell that to communities for, I don't know, Randy, 25 years. Couple more questions and then we'll probably start to close out. One is infrastructure related. There's a major safety issue someone raises in suburban communities, probably not in the city too, is that is the right turn on red. When cyclists have the green, intersecting with a perpendicular street and motorist has right on red, they're looking only for car traffic coming in the other direction and then crash. Do you have any specific fixes that would address that?
Don't allow it.
That's
I think the introduction of right on red was one of the worst safety things that was ever done in the United States. Technically, I'm not sure if it was done to save energy. It was supposedly done to save gasoline and energy. And then motorists found it so convenient that, it's too popular among motorists. But it's definitely a danger. I mean, I find it dangerous as a pedestrian and as a cyclist. I'm at the intersections, as I showed in that slide with New York City, the thing that really helps is prohibiting right or left-hand turns, or at least giving the cyclist and the pedestrian an advanced green light so that they're already visible and in the intersection, in the crosswalk before the car gets started. That's a real problem. But the right turn on red at a stop sign is just really bad news, bad news.
Right. We have a particular problem here in Chicago with a certain privatization deal that shall go unnamed, but all of our parking meters on street parking were sold off by the city to a private entity, and thus making it very, very difficult to repurpose that space. Take street parking, for example, to install a new bike lane or put in a corral or whatnot. Do you know of any other cities who've had to overcome something like that, and how have they done it?
We know the reverse, but not that. That is, in a number of European cities have either reduced the parking supply but they own the parking. They haven't sold it, so far as I know, Ralph. I mean, it's one of their key policies, by the way. Parking management is what they call it, which is managing of spaces, the location of spaces, the amount of time you can park there. Sometimes it's for residents only, which excludes then long distance commuters. And that's been in Vienna. It was a lot of people. Ralph actually interviewed about 50 different key actors in Vienna and asked, what is it that they reduced the percentage of trips by car in Vienna from 40% in 1992 to 27% in 2000, I think it was 17. That's a huge decline. And when Ralph interviewed all these people in Vienna, there were two reasons. One was the massive expansion of the metro system. They also vastly improved the cycling facilities in Vienna. But a third was parking management, making parking less available, drastically limiting the time of parking, and so forth and so on. But bad news, selling it off to a private operator and then making it difficult to install bike lanes. What do you think, Ralph?
I mean, the only thing that comes to mind is, again, from this recent work on Frankfurt, they have many 4-lane roadways in the city and they have parking next to them. and the parking they have is not privatized, but it's built in a way that it's parking. Then there is a gap with a big tree in it, and then there's parking again. So they couldn't take out the parking for bike lanes because nobody wanted to chop down all these trees. So
plant a tree.
no. The point is, it's similar to the situation you have. They couldn't touch the parking because the bike lane wouldn't fit there. But the only solution was so far to leave those roadways alone. And only now they have about a bike share of 20%. They have a new policy in the city, which was driven by a signature campaign of residents. They wanted to have a referendum, and pushed by that referendum, the city now says that they can take away car travel lanes in those. They still don't have to figure out what to do with the parking because it's still, the trees are still there, but they'll have to take the car travel lanes to build the bikeways. That's the only thing that comes to mind. They can't touch the parking for different reasons than you did, but the
Go Chicago. We're unique.
was to leave it alone.
Leave it to us to bring in a completely unique problem to which there are very few answers. Okay, I'm going to give you a softball to close it out. I think 8 o'clock is a good closing time. What is the difference, gentlemen, between your new book, Cycling for Sustainable Cities, and your earlier book, City Cycling?
Oh, it's huge, humongous. Well, for example, the chapter on Latin America is new. The chapter on China and India is new. There's the new chapter on e-bikes, that's new. The chapter on older adults is new. I insisted on that because I'm one of them. What are the other new chapters? There's a special chapter on policies and programs is new.
Social justice, the advocacy chapter are new. So we added many chapters, and the other chapters that we retained were greatly updated. So if you look at bicycling research and bicycling practice, between 2010 and 2020, the published papers and the knowledge in cycling skyrocketed. It's sort of amazing how many new studies, how many new papers came out in that time period. So all of these other chapters have been thoroughly updated and are much more well-grounded in research than before. So I was the chair of the TRB Bicycle Committee, that's a Transportation Research Board, and every annual meeting we get papers submitted on bicycling for review. And when I started around the early 2011 or something like that, maybe 2012, we had probably 50 papers we got for the annual meeting to review. By the time I left, we had 150 papers. So that sort of shows you how the knowledge in bicycling and the interest in it has increased, and that's also reflected in the book.
I'd like to just add one more thing, and that is that there is that special chapter 20 is entirely devoted to cycling advocacy. I think it's the longest chapter in the book. I was the lead author, but it was to coordinate really the efforts of all of these executive directors of various cycling agencies or organizations around the world. They were international, national, and state mainly. And it was just eye-opening seeing how effective these cycling organizations have been and what they've done to promote cycling. I'd like to have a statue to Randy and to you for promoting cycling there in Chicago. You have no idea how important you are. You really, really are. And it's just, by the way, we had 3 anonymous referees for the book. And of all the 21 chapters, the referees found that the advocacy chapter was their favorite chapter. So, I mean, we don't even know their names, but they all love the advocacy chapter because it's what they thought was really important, getting things implemented.
It was a setup. It was me all 3 times. All right. Well, just to close out, we cannot thank you 2 enough for spending your valuable time with us. We are really excited to promote this book. Go out and buy it, everybody. We will be sending everyone a wrap-up email that will include the recording to this, but also some of these great events that people have been kicking me through the chat, and dates and resources. There's a companion sort of webinar that was given last week on Latin America cycling by the Metropolitan Planning Council. Our own Linda Lopez was on that. So watch your email because we're going to send you a whole bunch of good stuff. And once again, thank you, John. Thank you, Ralph. And thank you, everyone, for taking some time tonight. We enjoyed.
One last word. If you're not a member of Active Trans, please become a member.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us, and thank you very much for attending.
Thank you very, very much, Melody. And thanks to everyone who attended. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Have a good